I'm going to start by looking rather specifically at the percussion solo piece, Entoptic, and maybe begin by outlining something about how the composition process worked, because, well, that's something that it's relatively perhaps easy or interesting to talk about in the context of this piece for reasons which will become clear as I go on. And there are various strands of influence which come together in this piece. And one of them, of course, is the collaboration with Peter, which has been going on for, well, since the beginning of my work with ELISION at the beginning of the 1990s. And one of the strands of that particular collaboration over the years has been that Peter has gradually been amassing and developing an instrumental array which he generally uses in more improvisational settings, involving various found objects, different ways of combining them together, some more traditional percussion instruments, and in particular using using these on a sort of amplified table where instruments can be brought to the microphone and taken away. So that was one influence which came to bear on how I started thinking about this piece. And actually, some of that may go back to our work together on the composition Opening of the Mouth in the 90s, because there is one part in that where one of the percussion stations where Peter has a selection of small instruments and two microphones where he's shaking the instruments and at the same time moving them from one microphone to the other, which in the amplification system produces a panning effect from one side to the other. And I was always really impressed by how well such a simple thing worked. So that was something which was in my mind as well. And so, so as I say, this first strand of influence that converges on the piece is Peter's instrument, and thinking of what it would take, what would be an interesting way to translate that instrumental concept into a more compositionally structured context. Okay, that was one thing. And then there was a stage that this process went through when I was still not entirely clear about how the solo piece would develop. And when I was in Melbourne in 2014 to work with a percussion trio, Speak Percussion, that Peter was working with at that time, on a program of pieces involving percussion and electronics in various different combinations. And so one of the ideas that, one of the pieces that found its way into that concert was a composition in my series of scores for improvisers that goes under the title Codex. This was Codex 14, which has actually been performed more recently very successfully in the US by Aaron and some percussionists in Austin, Texas, if I'm not mistaken. But I'm not, I was thinking that maybe I would play your recording today, but actually the recording that I made with Peter's group sounds a little bit more like going in the direction of the solo piece, so I thought it would be a better example from that point of view. And so the score of Codex 14 consists of 2 pages of verbal instructions and no notation at all. And it was basically a way of exploring a particular instrumental setup to, well, on one level to see whether it would work, what kind of result it would have. But of course, it also has to be interesting for an audience to listen to. So there was also the question of how to incorporate the basic idea, which I'll come to in a second, into a sort of into a structural context, as I was saying. So what I did in the percussion trio was that I asked each of the 3 percussionists to come along with a 4x4 array of small instruments that would fit onto a small space. And the selection of these instruments was completely up to them, except that they should be small. And then I took those instruments away into a studio, and I recorded various types of improvisation on them myself. Now, I'm not a percussionist, so I was just basically recording sounds rather than recording musical objects. But one of the things that I found particularly interesting in this part of the process was distinguishing different kinds of musical material from one another in terms of how one would move across the array. So making horizontal movements, making vertical movements, making diagonal movements. And those three types of movement then are at the basis of the three sections of the improvisational piece. And each of the percussionists has a microphone at each corner of their table, and then these are fed to the four speakers at the four corners of the space, such that the three percussion setups are superimposed on one another in the space of the performance. And to that I added, again in three phases, firstly sampled materials from my own computer instrument, which were untreated recordings of my improvisations on those setups. Secondly, recordings, those same recordings, but somewhat alienated from their original sound by electronic processing of various kinds. And thirdly, then much more processed, so that in some cases it's no longer possible to distinguish one instrument from another, or hear what objects produce those sounds. And so you have the three sections which get gradually more electronic in the electronic part, and also then three sections which explore different directions of movement along the percussion arrays in the score. And so at a certain point I thought, well, that's all we need for the moment, and let's see how that goes in performance. I can play you a little bit of it now. You hear sometimes that instruments are being brought to and fro in front of the microphones. It sounds very good when you play the recording back over a 4-channel system, because then you get all of these spatial positionings of the object. So that just goes into the beginning of the second section, where the first really obviously electronically transformed percussion sounds begin to happen. So yeah, this, as I say, the score consists of 2 pages of verbal instructions which give a certain amount of information as to what kind of sounds might be appropriate, as I said, but also a certain amount of information as to how the form proceeds, so that you can hear, even in that short excerpt, that there are moments of greater activity, lesser activity, there are dead stops, there are various structural interventions, if you like, which serve to reorientate the improvisational activity at various points during the piece. And that reminds me of another concept which I think is important in the development of this piece and of my compositions in general. And this is an idea which came to me a few years ago with regard to the relationship between improvisational and notational aspects in composition. And that is that if we look at this relationship historically of composers who become involved in improvisational activity, we see generally what happens is that the basic paradigm of the music remains a notational paradigm. That is to say, the framework of a composition is established through notation, and gaps are opened up in this framework through which improvisation can take place. So improvisation is something that happens in the gaps of the notation. And I thought, how would it be, well, first of all, I thought, how would it be if we turned that relationship on its head? And then secondly, I came to the conclusion that I had actually been doing that for a long time, which is to say that actually free improvisation is the basic paradigm on which the music is based. And notated composition provides points of structural and poetic focus, points of focus or centers of gravity around which that improvisation can flow. And I think Codex 14 is a very clear example of that. That's why I use the word compositional interventions into this field of improvisation, which produce a sort of minimal coloration of the space within which the music takes place. So a subtle encouragement to think in a particular kind of structural way about the improvisation that one is playing. And going further into that idea, one of the reasons for it is probably that anybody who is using, well, probably anybody who's using improvisation in a compositional context, what they are doing is entextualizing their own improvisational practice. So if I'm writing a piece of music for improvisers, one of the things that I'm doing is I'm encoding my own improvisational practice in that notation. I'm writing the kind of music that I would want to play. I'm giving the kind of directions, if any, to the performers that are the sort of directions that I would find most stimulating if I were taking part in such a performance myself. And so I think that is an aspect which serves in something like Codex 14 for there to be a certain kind of stylistic consistency in the way that the improvisation works, without my having to say, do this and then do this and then do this, but creating a context, creating a working atmosphere, if you like, which emerges from the kind of thinking that goes into my own improvisational practice, such that it puts all of us performers on a kind of level playing field from the start. And I think in retrospect that was something that worked quite well in that piece, because Peter and I had worked together very often before, but I had worked only once before with one of the other percussionists, and not at all with the third one. So it was a way of bringing us all together under one roof, and also, as I say, to provide points of focus during the piece, which are also points of refocusing the improvisation, so that the improvisational activity can then be as spontaneous as possible with the overall structural connections already being in place as a result of the score. So the score is there not to restrict what the players do, but quite the opposite. The score is there to liberate what the players do. The score is there to stimulate their imagination. And this is a test, if you like, that one can apply to pieces of music that use improvisation in different ways. Does the improvisational aspect of the score, does that serve to limit what the performer does to a certain range of things chosen by the composer, or on the other hand, does it stimulate the performer to invent something with their own imagination, which may or may not have any relation to what the composer might have thought of? Because if we're going to put improvisation into our compositions, then we should take that seriously. And by taking it seriously, I mean not to say there are certain things which are not allowed. Just as in a free improvisation without any notational input, we shouldn't say that there are certain things which are not allowed and certain things that are. I'll come back to that a little bit later, but I want to go a little bit further now into the specifics of this solo piece, Entoptic. And I don't know how many of you read the program note for the piece in the performance last night. It was rather long, rather embarrassingly long, I thought, but I felt that I wanted to make a few things clear. I don't think it was necessary to know all of those things in order to appreciate the music. At least I hope not. But again, I thought it might be an interesting thing to talk about the title, where the title comes from, what it refers to. So, having been through this experience of working with Codex 14, the next question was, what kind of structure in a solo composition could accommodate these kinds of ideas and add a further structural dimension to them? And so my thinking began then to go in the direction of, well, how can we, without specifying what the struck objects in the piece are, how can we firstly add an extra dimension to these horizontal, vertical, and diagonal movements across the array? And one way of doing that, of course, is to increase the complexity of those movements to include things like spiral movements and diagonal zigzags of different kinds. And to do that needs a larger array than just 16 instruments. So together with Peter, I came to the idea of using a 4x4 array of flat-topped instruments that could be scraped as well as struck. And then, because those were of a sufficient size, in the interstices between them there would be a 3x3 array of smaller, not necessarily flat-topped objects, giving 25 objects in all, which more or less cover the entire space of the table, so that by dragging a stick in one direction or another across the table, the stick doesn't actually fall in between the instruments, because there's no space for it to fall into. So alongside the flat-topped instruments, which are biscuit tins and gongs and metal serving bowls and various things like that, you have wood blocks, bottles and other found objects which form the 3x3 matrix. And none of these are actually specified in the score. Well, I'll show you a photograph of our original setup in a moment. There are one or two things which need to be there, but I don't say where they should be. So, for example, there is some metal object, a tray or a biscuit tin lid or something like that, which is crinkled in front of the microphones at a certain point. I was originally intending that that should form part of the array as well, without specifying where it is, but actually in the version that Peter has at the moment, that's something which sits separately from it because it has a particularly good sound when crinkled like that. So all of these things came together when I was studying this book of paleoanthropology by David Lewis Williams called The Mind in the Cave. And The Mind in the Cave starts off from considering the cave paintings in southern France and northern Spain, which were made in the Paleolithic era around about 30,000 years ago, and comparing those to various forms of graphic art which exist in more recent shamanistic societies. By extension, then, Lewis Williams is thinking that the Paleolithic human society was what we would now call a shamanistic society, which would base its belief systems on spirit quests and altered states, and going into the spirit world by means of techniques like hallucinogenic substances, sensory deprivation, and so forth, all of which probably had their part to play in the concept behind the cave paintings and how the cave paintings were used. And one of the aspects of this which also comes up in neurology is the idea of form constants. And form constants are indeed shapes such as cross-hatchings, spirals, randomly positioned dots, and various other shapes which we find not just in the cave paintings but in very many comparable artistic expressions in different cultures around the world. And the reason why they're constant, of course, is that they occur in all of these different cultures. And the reason why they occur in all of these different cultures is that in a certain way they are a map of the visual system in the brain. So when, for example, you push your fingers against your eyes and these patterns start to appear, one of the things that you're seeing is the structure of the point at which the optic nerve touches the brain. So by making these form constants, one of the things we're doing is looking at an internal structure to ourselves which otherwise we can't see. And I found that a rather fascinating idea, especially since in this percussion setup, you have a setup where the instrument occupies effectively, acoustically, the entire performance space. So we, as audience members, are inside the instrument as well. And so the material, the actual moment-to-moment material of the piece Entoptic is based entirely on these form constants. And if we go to the next slide, first of all, we can see the original instrumental setup. The one that you're using now is slightly different from this, right? It's a little bit more spaced out. But that was the setup that we originally decided on when we were working together in Melbourne. I think the current version is very similar to that. And then beneath that, you can see how the different objects are notated. So there are 4 two-line staves which show the four groups of 4 in the 4x4 matrix, and then there are, in between those, there are 3 one-line staves which show the 3x3 matrix in between. It's a shame, really, that it's not possible to notate in 3 dimensions, because then you could have the 2 dimensions of the table as the dimensions of the instrument, and then time as the 3rd dimension. But this works reasonably well, and it enables me then to to transcribe these movements into traditional, or more or less traditional notation. So this is what the beginning of the piece looks like then. And you can see that in the first line it concentrates very much on a particular kind of movement, which is a movement up the right-hand side of the array, which could also be heard very clearly in the concert. And so at various points the pattern congeals on repeating the same kind of pattern in space quite a few times before moving on to the next one. And at other points one pattern starts and then there's a point at which it changes to another pattern and so forth. So by altering the number of notes played in each pattern from a maximum of 25 to a minimum of 1, we move from a very clear spatial and timbral movement in the music to and from a more randomized use of the array. If I go back for one moment, the other thing that I didn't mention is the 3 phases of the piece and how those relate to the electronic part. And again, somehow this idea of 3 phases percolated through from the Codex 14 improvisational piece. So the idea was that, again, if we look at the way that the form constants, the altered states, work in shamanistic practice, one of the things that we see is that we start off from a waking situation, which is providing the conditions for this quest into the self or into the cave, or however we want to visualize it. And then the second phase is where the visual sensations take on the form of these form constants. The third phase then is the phase of hallucination, where those form constants congeal into the shape of whatever is suggested, like animals, for instance, in shamanistic practice. So the 3 phases are quite distinct from one another, and they're also very common between different societies which use this kind of spirit quest structure. So it seemed to me clear that that should be something which in this piece is using the live electronic component of the music to gradually move away from the pure spatialized acoustic sound of the percussion at the beginning to something which is very different from it. So in the second phase, the player has a sustain pedal, and when the sustain pedal is down, the computer is analyzing incoming percussive attacks and detecting the 4 most prominent partials in the spectrum, and then resynthesizing those as sine tones with percussive envelopes. So what that means in effect is that if the initial sound is very clearly pitched, then that reverberation will be very clearly pitched as well. If it's not clearly pitched, then the computer will find something in its inharmonic spectrum which it will then put out again in the form of these microtonal bell-like harmonies. And one of the interesting aspects of that as applied to this kind of percussion sound is that if you take the same object and hit it in very, very slightly different ways, then because the harmonic spectrum of the inharmonic spectrum, I should say, of the sound is so complex, it will produce different results. So you hit the same thing and it produces slightly different chords each time, 4-note chords. And depending on how pitched the instrument is, the response of this part of the program will be more or less predictable. So one of the things that it does, apart from expanding the timbral range of the instrument by bringing in all of this pitched material which wasn't really there before, it also creates another layer of unpredictability to the timbre, added to that which is already present in these non-purpose-built instruments. So that's the second phase. And then in the third phase of the piece, this is combined in different ways with a volume pedal, which is also operated by the player. And what the volume pedal does is it causes percussive attacks to open a gate to an ongoing fixed media sound file, which begins playing at that point. And as the pedal goes down, the decay time of this playback gradually gets longer, so that if the pedal is just put down very slightly, you hit something and then you get a short burst of whatever the fixed media is playing at that time. If you put the pedal right down, then the fixed media sound files will play until you bring the pedal up again. And the fixed media material is also composed in 4 channels, and the volume of each of those 4 channels is affected by where the instrument is that's being struck when it activates them, if that's clear enough. So again, the sounds become attached to the percussive sounds. And of course, the result, as you heard last night, it sounds like some kind of very complex transformation of what Peter is playing, but it's not actually. It's just tapping into something that's already there. And that's a technique, I'll come back to further uses of that later on, which has been of great interest to me in the last few years. And it's maybe a rather peripheral aspect of entoptic, but it's a much more central aspect of some other pieces that I'm going to talk about later on. Okay, so that then gives a basic shape for the piece, and we have the basic material for the piece, and we have the instrumental setup for the piece. But something that's very important to bear in mind is that, as far as I'm concerned, is not really enough. There needs to be some way of combining those together in a musically meaningful sort of way as well. So it's not something that just says, for example, you can do this for a while, then you can do this for a while, then you can do this for a while. But as you will have noticed, listening to the piece, as we go through to the second section and the third section, there are always moments where the music kind of folds back on itself and it returns to its starting point, or some developed version of its starting point. So every time a new way of articulating the material is added, and this happens more often than just 3 times during the course of the piece, then the development of the music is, so to speak, concentric. It adds more material to what's already there, but it also is constantly referring back to the material that's already there. So let's see. This is, as I say, the beginning of the piece, and then when we move on to this page here, we can see that at the top line we have the use of the sustain pedal, which is very straightforwardly notated, just like in piano music. Something a little bit unusual happens in the second line, as you can see, and that's a notational technique which I had to invent for this piece, because given that the material is based on different kinds of movements across the instrumental array, that also gives rise to the possibility of just playing glissandi across it. And to write out all the notes of which those glissandi consisted would lead to an extremely unnecessarily complex result. I mean, this is complex enough as it is, I suppose, but what happens with each box here is it indicates a direction of movement. If you look at the top left one there in that bar, there is a sort of zigzag movement which starts from the center and ends up at the top right. And then below you see the note that it begins with and the dotted glissandi which settle on a particular pitch at the points where the direction of the line changes. So I thought it would be much more clear to show in the box the actual direction of movement on the instrument, whereas the notation shows a movement which doesn't really look as if it's related to it that well, because it's a little bit like looking at constellations in the sky. We're looking at a single top to bottom dimension, whereas in fact there is another dimension behind it, which is the dimension in which these movements are actually taking place. So that's another notational idea which increasingly comes to be used in the piece. And then at the bottom there is an improvisational bar, where the reason for making this improvisational material rather than notating it is that it's something that depends very much on, well, it's to do with taking the two Chinese symbols and scraping them against one another. And whether the result sounds interesting or not depends much more on the player being able to respond from moment to moment to hearing what the instruments do, than with following a notational line of one sort or another. So that's something which again in various compositions that I've written makes it clear that what we're doing here is responding to the instabilities of the instrument in a way which would not be possible if we had a precise notation to work with. And we can have a look at another page. This is where the volume pedal starts coming in. So the volume pedal is written on a 5-line stave which indicates 4 different zones through which the pedal can move. In the top zone it does nothing. In the second zone, as I've notated it there, this is where it enters for the first time. The second zone we have a minimum decay time. As it goes down, we have a gradually increasing decay time until you can see at the bottom here, when the pedal is right down, the decay time is effectively infinite. It's not infinite because the sound file will run out eventually. So those are examples then of the 3 phases of the piece and how the material varies according to what kind of electronic context they are put in. Any questions so far?
So, Richard, can I just ask, if we went back to that little block of text from the school with the,
This one?
I just can't see, but I'd just be interested.
Shall I read it to you?
In relation to the question.
Yeah, well, it says improvisation with the hand cymbal pair involving, but not necessarily limited to, movement between the different microphones, friction between the 2 cymbals face to face and face to edge, sliding one or both cymbals over the remaining array, more or less rapid alternations between depressed and raised sustain pedal. So I did say earlier on that I don't like to give directions when it comes to improvisation, but I don't really see this as directions because this is basically anything that can happen, and I just wanted to use that to remind the player that there are no limits on what takes place there. So that's basically just a list of everything you can do with 2 cymbals, from which then the player can make a free choice. But it also says involving, but not necessarily limited to, these sounds. So there may be things I haven't thought of which can go in there as well. And probably I could have left that out. But basically it was a way of putting out all of the possible solutions to dealing with this particular bar, and then letting the player choose for him or herself which ones would be put into action. But that's may seem contradictory to what I said before, but I'm going to come back to that later anyway. Hopefully it'll become a little bit clearer.
Have you explored the form constant in any other composition?
Well, this is a very recent composition, so it's really the beginning of an exploration of this sort of idea, which also finds its way into the piece for trombone and electronics that you heard a little bit of last night, and some music for ensemble, which I'm currently working on. So. Yeah, I suppose it's something that's actually common to a lot of music as well, because there are things that correspond to form constants in traditional music, scales and maybe glissandi and sustained chords and unison rhythms and various things like that, which could be construed as a sonic representation of this kind of archetypal visual phenomenon. I don't know how far one can take that analogy, but for example, you know, when I mention that, it immediately puts me in mind of all the diagrams that we see associated with the Xenakis piece Metastasis, where you have these ruled surfaces where curves are made out of intersecting lines, and that quite explicitly for Xenakis was a way of translating into sound what was basically a geometrical concept. So there is a possible relationship to be found there as well. But yeah, I would say that I'm at the beginnings of my exploration of this particular idea now, and it seemed to be particularly appropriate in this context because it's rather readily enabled by the instrumental setup, because you can not only hear the movements across the percussion array in terms of the sounds that they consist of, but even more clearly than that, you can hear them as spatial movements. At least I hope you can, because I was slightly outside the square when I was listening to it. But when we were rehearsing, I was sitting in the middle, and I thought, yeah, this is reasonably convincing that we can hear these things going on. So the movement of the sounds in space becomes a compositional determinant in the piece, and not in a kind of abstracted theoretical way, but actually in a way that we can, I think, as the piece goes on, associate particular sounds with particular positions in space as well. I mean, that is something that might come with greater acquaintance with the music. But that, I hope, points towards the idea that everything I'm saying now can actually be derived from listening to the music if one acquaints oneself with it sufficiently closely. Shall I carry on? Right. So that concludes what I had to say specifically about that piece. And there are two other concepts that I would like to mention. One of them actually carries on straight from the percussion piece, which is an idea that I call induced synchronization, and that is where a live instrument is in some way affecting the playback of fixed media electronic material. Now, why do I think that's an interesting idea? Well, of course, historically there have been very many fascinating pieces which combine live performance with fixed media electronic music in various ways from the 1950s onwards. And one of the criticisms, one of the difficulties that arises from music like that is that the electronic part is not able to be flexible in terms of timbre, and so it forces the instrumentalist or instrumentalists into a kind of straitjacket where they have to be precisely timed according to the events that take place on the tape as it used to be. And again, as an entextualization of my own way of thinking musically, I don't find that a particularly attractive idea. That is, to synchronize myself to something which is completely inflexible in terms of time. I should say that more precisely, it's one of the possibilities, but it shouldn't be the only one. So how do we get over that idea? Well, of course, one way of getting past it is by using interactive live electronics. And that's something which I've worked with on numerous occasions in various pieces, but it's something that I tend to, in general, stay away from, taking my work more in other directions, firstly by having the electronic part actually performed by a performer. So the interaction that takes place between the electronics and the instruments is then a chamber music interaction rather than a technological one. And secondly, this idea of induced synchronization. Now, I think when we are making music with interactive live electronics, one of the difficulties that can arise there is that somehow we have to justify the fact that it's real-time interaction by always having some kind of audible relationship between what the instrument is doing or instruments and what the electronics are doing, so that it's important to be able to make that connection during the performance. Otherwise, what's the point in the interaction taking place in real time? The first time that I used this induced synchronization idea on a large scale was in a very big piece for cello and live electronics called Lifeform, which is from 2012. And when I started working on the electronic part of this piece, before writing the score, which is, I guess, also quite an unusual thing to do. And my initial idea was that I should use sounds which were derived in some way from bowed strings, so as to create a continuity with the live instrument. But after a very short time of actually working on the sounds, I found myself going in a completely different direction, which was towards generating sounds synthetically. Which had no relation to bowed strings at all, either through physical modeling or similarity or articulation or anything like that. And so it became clear to me within this composition process that what was going to happen in the final piece was that the cello was going to be confronted with an environment of sounds which would not be cello sounds. So then we have the question of, well, how do we relate those things to one another? How can they be thought of as belonging in the same piece? Well, one way of doing it is to say they don't belong in the same piece, they just happen to take place at the same time, which is one of the possibilities that I allow myself. But at the other end of the scale of interaction, you have a situation where the instrument and the electronic part are precisely synchronized with one another. And how would it then be possible to achieve something like that without having a completely fixed media part in advance? And so then the idea came in of using the instrument as a basis for analysis by the computer, an analysis which would then lead to various different aspects of the fixed media material being affected. So in Lifeform, for instance, in the first half, the cello begins in its central register, and you have a lot of activity going on in the extreme high and extreme low register in the electronics. And the closer the cello gets either to the low material or to the high material, the quieter that material gets, so that when the cello eventually reaches its top range, it actually cuts off the top material when it's there, and when it goes down to its lower range, it cuts that material off as well. So by the end of the first section of the piece, there is a kind of dialogue between cello and electronic sounds which is taking place alternately in the extreme low register. The low C string of the cello is tuned down to an F at that point, and the extreme high register. So that's one of the things that takes place. Another thing that takes place is that the fixed media material is an extremely complex, multi-layered texture of sounds, and the pitch of the cello is detected and used as the center frequency of a band reject filter which is applied to the entire fixed media part. So the cello carves out a space for itself within the frequency range of the electronic part. And what else? And there's another part where the dynamic relationship between cello and fixed media music gradually increases, so that by the end of the penultimate section of the piece, the cello is making these huge attacks, and each one of them has a massive chord attached to it, which gradually fades away. So there's a total synchronization between the two, although in fact what's happening is that the electronic part just consists of a drone which is running throughout, and its dynamic is completely controlled by the dynamic of the cello by the end of the section, and this degree of control is gradually being increased over the course of it. So live form is around about 55 minutes long, so it has space within that duration to explore very many different ways of bringing these things together. And the same idea then comes into Worldline, a piece for electric lap steel guitar, trumpet and percussion with electronics, which I wrote for ELISION a little bit later. And in a couple of sections of that, then the lap steel guitar is controlling the dynamic of the electronic part, either positively, so that the electronic part plays when Darryl plays, or negatively, so that it plays when he doesn't play. And after that, I began to come to the idea that maybe it would be interesting to build a kind of induced synchronization toolbox, which could be adapted to different musical situations and used almost as a kind of instrument for playing various different kinds of electronic sounds in various different kinds of compositional contexts. And to this end, I've been working together with the programmer Patrick Delgès at the Henri Pousseur Center in Liège, mainly because he's a much better and quicker programmer than I am. And so we're at the moment evolving this toolbox. And the first results of the toolbox are in the piece for trombone and electronics, Membrane. And you heard a solo part from that last night, but the entire piece is about 30 minutes long and uses various different ways of extracting information from what the trombone plays and applying that information to what the electronics do. And I think that my work in this direction is also really at quite an early stage at the moment, and there are very many possibilities to explore as time goes on. And of course, another reason for using the idea of induced synchronization rather than live electronics is that it's possible for me to compose complex spatializations in 8 channels. Membrane for trombone and live form for cello use 8-channel electronics without having to generate those in real time in any way. So it has the advantage of being able to compose the electronic sounds in great detail, and at the same time the advantage of being able to combine those with instrumental music in a way that allows for flexibility in performance. Okay. So, yeah, I won't say too much more about that now, because we heard a small example of it in the 3rd section of Entoptic last night, but a much more extended treatment of this idea is coming up in the complete performance of Membrane that takes place tomorrow. And so the last idea that I want to discuss a little bit with a couple of examples is something called seeded improvisation. And this really arises from the idea of using a compositional, a notational context to stimulate the improvisational imagination of players without determining anything about what they do with the improvisation. And this is something that started in another piece I wrote for ELISION, which is Transmission for Electric Guitar and Live Electronics, which Darryl and I first played in 1999, and which became part of the cycle Dark Matter a little bit later on. And one section of this, we have the guitar part consists of 36 very small fragments. Some of them are about a system long, some of them are just a single note. And an electronic part which consists of 36 pre-recorded fragments. And what we do in a performance of that is we have to play through those fragments in order, but intersperse them with whatever we want, which can be silence, which can be improvisation, which can be based on what has just been played, or based on what you're just about to play, or based on what the other person is doing at that point, which itself might be improvisational or compositional. And I found this to be a really fascinating and idea full of potential, which again I've been trying to explore as much as possible in the music that's been written in that time. Well, it's 20 years now, I guess. And so one example of that was in 2007. I was asked by the pianist Sarah Nichols to write a piece for piano and electronics, and I thought, how would it be if we extended this idea of that one section of transmission over an entire piece? What kind of compositional approach to the notated music would that involve? And I realized that I already had some material which could be used in that way, which was a piece of music written a couple of years earlier called Lost for solo piano. And the way that this composition was written was by firstly creating a very consistent sound process, which I think if you put all of those things end to end, it would last 2 minutes or so, where the two hands begin playing in parallel 3 octaves apart. It's very, very clearly definable, very clearly audible material, and then they gradually go out of synchronization with one another, and so it turns into a canon, and then the pitches gradually drift away, so it stops being a canon and turns into another kind of 2-part counterpoint, and so forth. And so that formed a basic material which I then at systematic places cut into, opened out the space and composed something which would fill in the gap in between two, well, one moment and the next moment in the original material. And that could take the form of taking what was there before and intensifying it, or taking what was there before and dissipating it, or taking what comes next and dissipating towards it, or intensifying towards it, or making a transition between here and here, or taking what happens at either end and looping or freezing it, or putting in something which had no relationship to either side. So those are all different categories of interpolation which were used in the next stage of the composition. And then I think when I was working on the original piano piece, there were 4 layers of interpolation, so that sometimes one interpolation happens in the middle of another one. And then there are all these different types of interpolation which take place. So that resulted in a 9-minute piano piece. But I thought there was something very elegant about the way that by splitting that up with improvisation at points to be decided by the performer in live performance, then that takes the very process by which the notated music was composed into the real time of the improvisational performance. So at any point, the player is able to stop what she's playing and play something else of her own choice, and then return to the point that had been reached previously. And then the electronic part that went along with that was based on, first of all, recording the piano piece in its original form. Secondly, splitting it up into a number of fragments which did not correspond to structural divisions, reordering those and transforming them to varying degrees. So the electronic part starts off at more or less the same pitch and timing as the piano part, and gets progressively compressed and stretched in time, and also shifted up and down in pitch as it goes on, and transformed in other ways as well. So it follows one of the structural processes which is going on in the notated music. And so then, during a performance of the duo, both people are able to interrupt their fixed material at any point and replace it with improvisation. And since that piece has been released on a CD and it's not so difficult to find, I'm not going to talk about that now, but I'm going to play a little bit of another example of this kind of approach, which is a piece called Tendril for harp and electronics, which I wrote for Milana Zaric in 2016. And you can see in this page here, well, I think it's reasonably clear once I explain it at least, that there is a sort of basic material to the music which you see in the first and third bars of the first system, and in the second bar of the second system, and in the whole of the third system, where there are two independent parts for the two hands of the harpist, which are more or less in a median register, which are constantly changing in terms of the amount of glissandi which are being played, the degree to which normally played notes are replaced by harmonics, the articulation between staccato and legato, and so on. And you can also see that the rate at which pedal changes are taking place is more or less regular. So the material is actually based on a series of pedal changes which, well, I won't go into great detail about that, but basically the pedal system of the concert harp is subjected to a kind of serialization, such that by changing one pedal at a time, you arrive after 7 changes with a completely different set of pitches than the one you started off with, and that keeps happening and cycling through the piece. And in the other bars you can see here, there are various extrapolations of that material in exactly the way I described for the piano piece. So what happens here is that we take the pitches that we arrive at the beginning of the cut and kind of scrunch them up together into a cluster. Here we take the pitches and freeze or loop them into a repeating figure, which basically creates a constant texture for a few seconds. And here in the central bar of the first system, the material that happens in the interpolation is not related to anything that came before or after, but it's just something that kind of explodes out of the system, so to speak. And then a similar kind of process was carried out with the electronic part, so that, again, each performer is able to interrupt what they're doing and replace it with improvisation, and then go back to the previous material. So I'll play a little bit of this so you can have an idea of how it actually works in practice. Let me just start that again. Maybe a little bit quieter. Oh, it's on it. Where's the volume control, Aaron? It's just blasting my head off here a bit, that's all. Thanks. Let's try that once more. Oops. Back to the start. Here we go. Since we're getting a bit short of time, I'll cut that off there. But you get the idea anyway. And one of the most interesting things about that, as far as I'm concerned, is that I've always thought that there is we fall almost naturally into different ways of listening to things according to whether we think they're being spontaneously created or whether they're the result of some longer-term structural reflection which ends up in notation. And those are, I guess, two different ways of hearing the complexity of the sounds that one is listening to. So on the one hand, you have the complexity of the solo saxophone music of Evan Parker, where there is a huge amount of sonic activity going on, but it's the result of being able to respond very spontaneously to instabilities in the way that the instrument reacts to certain ways of playing, rather than of saying, at this moment exactly this thing is going to happen. Whereas the complexity of a notated score, which is proposing exactly that at any given moment there is a particular combination of sound events taking place which add together into a more or less considered structure. It's somehow a different kind of perceptual complexity. So something I find very interesting here is that a lot of the time we don't really know which kind of complexity we're listening to, because sometimes we're hearing something which is very obviously composed, sometimes something which is very obviously spontaneous, sometimes something which is not seemingly either one thing or the other. And by oscillating very rapidly between extremes of specification and spontaneity, this music is intended to, or at least one of the possibilities is that it creates a way of listening which is not dependent on thinking about how the music got to be the way that it is. And so to come back to the point that you brought up earlier on, in a situation like this, there is really no purpose at all in specifying what a performer does when he or she is improvising away from the notated or fixed media part, because they will inevitably be influenced by that, but I'm not really interested in telling them how to be influenced by it. So in the course of various performances of this piece for harp and electronics, it takes on a kind of history of its own, whereby there are moments which tend to congeal into the same sort of combination from one performance to another. But it could be that you try to do that, but then you realize that you're a long way ahead of your partner or a long way behind, and it's not possible to get into a habit of every performance being a sort of more refined version of the previous one. So it's also something which gives a certain kind of unpredictability to the performers, so that performers are always to a certain extent on edge and not knowing how things are going to pan out, except in a much more global kind of structural way. And another aspect of that then is because the electronic part is based on the same material as the live harp but reordered, that sometimes you hear a processed version of some particular phrase or texture before you hear the actual thing. So that's another thing that we can't do in real-time interactive electronics, because the real time means you can't go back in time. And in a situation like this, it's possible for the electronically transformed version of something to happen before that something itself. So it takes on an extra time dimension, whereas in real-time electronic music, without a second performer, so to speak, one is very often stuck with the idea of everything that happens in the computer has to happen either at the same time as or after what the instrumentalist does. Right, I'm going to finish soon, but I want to say a couple more things before I do. And one is to bring in this idea of conglomerate compositions, which I suppose is familiar to anybody who knows anything about my work. But I wanted in particular to play a short fragment from something that I'm not sure anybody in this room will have heard, which is an ongoing work in progress called Natural Causes. Natural Causes is a piece that will eventually be round about 2 hours in length and consist of 4 acts. The third act was commissioned by and performed by the Musikfabrik Ensemble a couple of years ago. The form that this whole thing takes is based on a series of poems which was written for me by the late English poet Simon Howard in 2013. And he and I had been discussing a collaboration on some sort of work for some years previously. And I said that I was thinking of something which would involve an ensemble of 16 instruments, and so the number 16 had to be important there somehow. And then the text that he delivered to me is in 16 parts, and each part has 16 lines. And so there is a very strong kind of correspondence there with the kind of way in which I like to structure and permutate different aspects of the form of a piece of music. And one of the things that Simon said when he sent the poems was that he didn't feel that they belonged to him once he sent them, so I could deal with them in any way at all. They could be set to music for singers to sing, or they could do something completely different. And in fact, they end up doing something completely different. One reason for that is that Simon died very suddenly a couple of months after the texts were delivered. So, well, that's why the cycle has the title that it does. But it's also something that deals with absence in some very particular ways, which I think might become more clear when the entire cycle is finished. So the way that this works as a conglomerate composition and a seated improvisation is that there are a number of different pieces which are split up into sections and superimposed on one another. So there is a vocal piece which occurs all in one place. There is an instrumental quartet which is divided into 4 movements which are dotted through the entire form. There is a piece for ensemble which consists of 8 movements which is dotted through the entire form, and there is also a set of improvisatory procedures, which has 16 sections and which is also dotted through the whole thing. So the form of the entire piece, which is about 32 minutes long, is very complex, and there are usually 2 or 3 different pieces going on simultaneously. But over and above that, the way that it works in general is that there is a kind of matrix of improvisational activity into which these different instrumental movements are thrown or floated, or in exactly the way that I meant when I said they form points of structural and poetic focus within this matrix of improvisation. So I'm going to play a few minutes of it now, and then maybe if we have a little while longer, we can discuss things. Mm-hmm. Okay, let's stop there. So, so that this idea then of making a conglomerate composition out of kind of improvisational matrix with these points of focus is something that I think is the first stage of fulfillment, if you like, of this idea that I originally had of free improvisation being a paradigm and notated composition being something which is inserted into it to give it those centers of gravity, rather than looking at things the way they have been in the past, which is using the notated composition as a paradigm where gaps are open for improvisation. And so this is then going to carry forward into my present projects, which are, one of them is called Dying Words. It's for the Ensemble Imaginaire in Strasbourg, a trio for flute, saxophone and piano, which consists of a number of components which are partly finished at this point, and then the current work in progress for ELISION entitled Psyche, which incorporates all of the music of mine that you heard yesterday evening and quite a lot more, some of which has been written so far.